Hi, everyone. Judge Andrew and Tano here for Judging Freedom. Today is Monday, November 27, 2023. Larry Johnson joins us now, as is customary on Monday mornings here in the U.S. Larry, a pleasure. Thank you for joining us. I have a lot of questions for you, of course, about Ukraine and the Western underestimation of President Putin, his patience as well as the strength of his military. I have some questions to ask you about the IDF in Gaza. But before that, the Turkish flotilla of 1,000 commercial boats, about which you and I spoke last week, what has become of that? Do you know?
Yeah, well, what's being reported in the press is they're supposed to assemble this Wednesday and sell for Gaza. Last week, they were reporting that they were going to sell imminently last week, so I don't know what accounts for the delay. What is different about this flotilla compared to, I think the last one was 2010. It's much larger, and it has a much larger international presence of people from other countries. It will be an interesting confrontation, to say the least, to see what Israel does. In the past, Israel has been able to board, seize the ship, and then tow it into port. But Israel does not have a navy large enough to tow 1,000 ships. And in some of the previous confrontations, Israel did end up killing one American and several Turkish citizens. If Israel gets into a similar confrontation this time, that clearly is not going to help its image.
This is not the Turkish Navy or the Turkish military. These are Turkish commercial boats, fishing boats, boats that transport goods, correct?
Yeah, and personal and private yachts. So this is...
What is their goal? Is it to provoke the Israeli military?
Yeah, part of it. I think it's just to simply embarrass Israel, to force, to, again, feed into the meme of Israel as a violator of human rights and denying people humanitarian assistance, so that it is very symbolic in that way. But it's also genuinely trying to help provide aid into the Gaza Strip right now.
How is it that Israel can violate human rights on such a massive scale, whereby the IDF has killed more women and children in 8 weeks than the Russian military has killed in Ukraine in 18 months? Yeah, and the outcry seems to be limited to, correct me if I'm wrong, Larry, the region around Israel. There's no outcry here. There's no outcry in Europe. There isn't even an outcry from the typical leftish and civil liberties groups that complain about this stuff.
Well, not exactly, because we've actually seen, or let's answer your first question, the reason they're able to do it is because the United States allows them to do it. The United States is in a position to stop Israel cold because Israel is utterly dependent on the United States for military support in order to stay in this fight. And it is a lopsided fight, to be clear. But what we've seen is that in the past, a lot of the outrage would be confined to the surrounding countries, but it has spread. So there's a real break between governments and popular support. You're seeing the streets of London filled with massive protests in support of the Palestinians. You're seeing that in other countries, in Europe, in Spain. You're also having legislators in places like Spain and in Ireland, speaking out, condemn Israel. I think it was from a couple of ministers, one from the and from Brussels. They went down to the border of Rafah, and they made a very strong statement, condemn what Israel was doing.
Have any governments, as you've suggested the U.S. government could do if Joe Biden picked up the phone, have any governments in the West, Western Europe, North America condemn the slaughter in Gaza?
Yeah, no, yes, these two European states, I think it was the Dutch, at least it was the Dutch. I forget the other one, and Belgium, Dutch, and Belgium. They were down at Werwicke Crossing, and they made a very strong condemnation of Israel. And then B. Netanyahu basically called in their diplomats, and he was outraged at it. Then one of the guys who made the statement responded to B. I meant every word I said basically like that. Israel is not winning the PR battle, and this whole hostage release that is taking place really has shifted the tone.
How has it shifted the tone?
Because it's portraying the Palestinians not as these violent, bloodthirsty murderers, but the hostages that were supposedly being tortured and raped, they're being released. They look happy. Some are even seem solicitors towards the previous captors. They're in good health. The crowds of the Palestinians that are coming out to welcome their folks who have been released are jubilant. They're massive. And when you look at some of the people that are being released, they're not these hardened terrorists. There's one woman who had suffered terrible burns, and the Israelis refused to give her proper medical care. The plastic surgery needed to repair those burns while in prison. And she was in prison for 6 years, and she did not commit a criminal act. But what's really important here is that so many of these Palestinians that were jailed without due process. But it's the old excuse. Well, we're at war, and so when we're at war, you can do anything you want.
Why are the Israelis who are being released by Hamas called hostages and the Palestinians who are being released by Israel called prisoners? They're not convicts. They haven't even been charged, much less tried.
Yeah, that's a clear example of how language is used to structure the meme or how it's supposed to be perceived that the hostages were unjustly taken, whereas these prisoners, they must have done something bad and they deserved it. Well, the situation is complicated because I'm not trying to pretend that Hamas is some humanitarian organization, but within the United States, we come out of a heritage of revolution. We come out of a heritage of people who took up arms against the established power that Great Britain's relation to the United States is much the same as Israel's relationship is to Palestine. And we rose up to get rid of that, and we celebrate that in the United States, or at least once did. But for these Palestinians who are wanting to be free, where they have their own country, where they're not subject to Israeli military rule, the capricious arbitrary enforcement of rules where property is taken. We've seen just in recent days where Israeli settlers who are illegally occupying territory that belongs to Palestine are bulldozing olive trees, which are an essential element of their economy, of their income. So, as this thing goes on, there's growing revulsion. You've heard Scott Ritter talk about it, that he no longer stands with Israel, and once time would stand with them. It's the thing that you don't wish ill for the Israelis, but they cannot continue to treat the Palestinians like they're cattle.
Are they losing the PR war in the West?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. In the United States, not so much. There is, I think, a larger, let's call it, an anti-Israel sentiment today than we've seen in the past. But around the rest of the world, Israel is really getting one black eye after another, and a lot of it's self-inflicted. They've